Okay, it's 12 o'clock, so I think we can get going. As people are just starting to join, just want to welcome everyone. And Victoria, just see your question. The webinar is 1 hour. And want to really welcome everyone to this space here all together. I know we can't all see each other. But this is being hosted by the Arthur Summer Rotenberg Suicide and Depression Studies Program at the University of Toronto and St. Michael's Hospital. And my name is Sakina Rizvi. I have the pleasure of being the chair of this program, where we focus on research, on clinical intervention, and on education. So this speaker series is something we've been wanting to do for some time. There's a lot of really impressive research going on around the world in the area of suicide prevention. I find it very inspiring. I find it very hopeful, and it's really important, I think, for the community and for the general public to know about all of those details. So we're going to be running this speaker series monthly from September to May, so the academic season. We'll be switching from to Mondays on the regular. So today we're having it on Wednesday because today is actually World Suicide Prevention Day. So we're hosting this in honor of that. But we'll be switching to Mondays from 12 to 1. Our next one is on October 20th. And Jackie will throw in a link in the chat that you can access to get updates on what the talks are going to be. For this talk, also just noting that there is a QA at the bottom panel. If you can put any questions there, that's what I'll be monitoring once Dr. Choudhury has done her talk. So I'm so pleased to introduce our speaker today as our inaugural speaker, and this is Dr. Munmun Choudhury, who is sorry, let me just grab my notes here. She's the G.Z. Liang Professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She's the co-lead of patient-centered care delivery at the Pediatric Technology Center. Dr. Choudhury is an expert in computational social science, human-computer interaction, and digital mental health. Her research focuses on how social media and digital data can help detect and support mental health challenges. And she has worked extensively with collaborators across academia, industry, and public health. Dr. Choudhury, she's very impressive. She's received numerous awards for her work, including the 2023 Special Interest Group on Human Interaction Societal Impact Award, and also the Rising Star Award for the ACMW. And she was also inducted in 2024 to the Special Interest Group on Computer Human Interaction Academy. She also contributes to policy and advocacy initiatives, providing expert guidance to governments and international organizations, including the U.S. Surgeon General and the World Health Organization. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Choudhury, and you can take over.
Thank you, Dr. Rizvi, and thank you everyone for having me here today. Let me see if I can share my slides. Could I get a quick check from somebody that you can see the slides?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, thank you so much. All right. Well, thank you again for having me here today on a very special day, because today is the World Suicide Prevention Day, and it is such an honor to speak to you a little bit about some of the different ways that artificial intelligence and social media can help us towards our mission for suicide prevention. And today I will be reviewing some of the work that my group at Georgia Tech has been doing over the last decade, kind of looking to different types of data, especially social media data, as a sort of ecological source of information that can tell us things about suicide that are probably all these years have been difficult. Before I get started, I would note that this presentation does have a content warning. Given the topic that we are focusing on, I will be talking about serious mental illness, substance use, and suicide. So please, I recommend self-care tips and anything that you need to do to take care of yourself. That's very important. So the question of how to care for somebody with mental health struggles, somebody who has struggles of suicide, this is not a new question. In fact, the question that has existed since antiquity. The only difference is that the answer to that question, it has evolved over centuries and millennia, and evolved because our understandings of human biology, our understanding of psychology, recent developments in medicine, technology, these things have evolved over the years. But what is true is that for the last 7,000 years, we have made efforts to care for individuals who have these difficult struggles. That history is very important, although it's not a flattering one. And I mention this history because it allows us to reflect back on what used to be the case, what the current state of the situation is, and where we could be headed going forward. One useful way to reflect on that history is to think in terms of what are called paradigms. So one of my favorite authors, Thomas Kuhn, who wrote the book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in that book, he proposed this notion of paradigm shifts as a way to understand how scientific progress happens in any field. What we understand when we look back at the history of this field, history of mental health in particular, we see that there are a few notable paradigms that I've seen over the years. About 100 years ago, the first paradigm was the paradigm of psychoanalysis, which emerged in the works of a famous philosopher and psychologist of that time, Sigmund Freud. And that was actually the first scientific approach towards understanding the how when people experience distress, what are some of the ways that we can come to understand that. A lot has happened over the years. In the middle of the last century, 20th century, we saw another paradigm shift, which was with pharmacological treatments coming forward. And we saw how all of these pharmacological developments started to make significant, initiatives in moving the needle on helping people with mental health struggles. At that point in time, we also saw the emergence of a couple of different kinds of paradigm. And one paradigm was what we can call a biological paradigm to mental health, which is the idea where researchers started to consider mental health conditions as disorders of brain physiology. But a second paradigm, which kind of originated at the same time, was one in which behavioral and cognitive researchers and psychologists started to think about sort of this individual who has these mental health struggles to be an active interpreter of their situation. And that over the years gave rise to what we commonly, even today, know as one of the most prominent treatments called cognitive behavioral therapy. So I guess you would agree with me that over the last 100 years, this is phenomenal progress. We have seen so many paradigm shifts. We have seen, a history in which we have recognized mental health challenges to be something that people need care and support for. We have come up with at least a few solutions, potential solutions to these challenges, and many people benefited from these scientific progress. And yet, in 2025, we are still asking the same question that we asked 7,000 years ago, which is there a way for us to better help these individuals? And why is that so? The reason is, even with so many paradigm shifts in this field, we still have outstanding questions. We still have people who we are losing to preventable suicides. And why is that so? To a large extent, it is because we still have systemic barriers to accessing care and help. We have stigma in the society, and we have a lack of access. We have limited access to people who might need help the most. So now in 2025, the question arises, what would that fourth paradigm of mental health look like? Could there be a way that we can change the narrative? We can shift the progress in a way that addresses some of these outstanding challenges on the field so that we can, we can prevent all these lives that are getting lost to suicide in a meaningful way. The paradigm the potential I'm going to be talking to you about today is the one that is offered by artificial intelligence. And over the course of the next several minutes, the idea will be to tell you a little bit about what potential artificial intelligence as a technology holds for us going forward. But why am I talking about artificial intelligence, right? For that, we have to take a little bit of a step back. And I'm going to share a personal story with you. A couple years back, one of my then PhD students, Sachin, introduced me to this book, which you see up on the slide, called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Many of you might have read this book or recognize this book. And this book is very significant in mental health because it is a book in which the author van der Kolk said that the way we experience mental distress, it happens through how our body has a way to keep track of that distress. The body, in some ways, keeps the score of our experiences of these distresses. But the way we as individuals, as people, experience and come to understand that distress is shaped by who we are as people. It is shaped by who is around us, who is part of our social context, what communities do we live in. And in order to understand why we experience despair, helplessness, suicidal thoughts, things like that, it is very important to understand that context. Essentially, the ecology of our lives, because that's what the body uses to keep a score of our mental distress. We are seeing very unprecedented changes and what ends up keeping a score of what we experience, right? You could argue that today technology advancements have evolved so much that we have algorithms or essentially programs that are written in a way that keep track of what is happening around in certain ways as an alternative to our bodies keeping a score of our mental distress. So in some ways, if we go by van der Kolk's position, it is no longer just our bodies keeping a score of what we are feeling, but in many ways, algorithms that are sprinkled around us are also doing the same thing. So let us try to understand how these algorithms are operating and how these algorithms that are often powered by artificial intelligence can enable us to get a better understanding of our distress and helplessness with hopefully the potential to move the needle to prevent suicide. So algorithms today don't work in a vacuum. The algorithms that I'm talking about that are powered by AI, they learn from tons and tons of data. This is something that you may have already heard about in terms of how these AI tools have inbuilt mechanisms to learn patterns from digital trace data. I'm going to be giving you examples of trace data that can be gathered online from the myriad activities that we perform online. We search, we browse, we post stuff, we connect with our friends, we watch videos, we share photos, we share where we are. And all of these rich forms of data can tell a lot about that social context that van der Kolk was talking about in terms of the body keeping the score. What if we are able to harness those signals towards understanding not just what we are experiencing, but also hopefully forecasting in terms of what might happen going forward? So this is one of our missions in the early work that we did several years ago. And it was particularly motivated by the fact that when we talk about these digital trace data, it is a type of data that is exploding, so to speak, right? More and more people are using internet technologies, internet platforms. We are spending more time on social media and digital technologies. And here are some trends that have been observed over the years, and we see across age groups, across demographics, across different times, at time periods, there have been increases in the use of digital technologies, thus creating sort of this rich information from which we can learn all of these experiences of our social context. So let us take a look at the potentials that are offered by these data sources in the light of these types of technologies essentially helping keep a score of our mental health. In one of the early studies that we conducted some years ago, what we wanted to understand is that what are the kinds of patterns, what are the kinds of signals that are present in these digital trace data, particularly social media data, and can these signals hold information that can tell us about the onset of significant adverse mental health events? In this case, we were interested in the onset of major depressive disorder, which often is a precursor to suicide in many individuals. Many individuals with suicidal thoughts or behaviors often have a underlying psychiatric challenge. So if we are able to understand or identify when the onset of that condition is happening, it would put us in a better position to intervene. So what we did is we recruited individuals, and this included people that were recruited from a crowdsourcing platform, such as Amazon's Mechanical Turk, and these people were screened for major depression. So some of them were, screened positive for moderate to severe major depressive disorder, while others did not. After that, for these individuals, we obtained their consent. We asked them if they would share their Twitter data with us. At one in time, Twitter was one of the major platforms that people used for their social activities. They gave us access to that data, and it was the part of the data set that preceded their reported onset of major depression is the data that we worked with and we were interested in. What we wanted to know is, what are these signals? Are there any signals present in that year-long period of data preceding their onset of major depression that can tell us essentially about their experiences? This signal we found was incredibly helpful. We were able to develop essentially an index of major depression based on a machine learning algorithm that we built using these data. And what I'm going to tell you, what we found is that this index of major depression that we were able to create with social media signals, it mapped very well with the prevalence of depression that was reported through survey data throughout the United States, as you can see in the slide. If you look at any given state in the slide on the left side, and then you look at the same state on the right side, you would see that the colors kind of are close together in terms of their intensity. And that means that the prevalence of depression that reported and the prevalence of depression that was reported by the CDC, they more or less matched with each other. So this potential using social media data in order to identify and essentially assess some type of mental health risk, we wanted to expand those efforts, and we wanted to see if this kind of a algorithmic measurement could be applied in other contexts and in other populations and granularities as well. So this was another context in which we applied that strategy. This context was college communities or college campuses. And as we all would recognize, this is a context in which we do see significant mental health challenges. So any ability to be able to measure what kinds of challenges young people are experiencing in this population can go a long way to minimizing fully mitigating some of the negative impacts of poor mental health that can have not just on the academic lives of these young people, but also the different ways that they may negatively impact such a critical and important part of their life. So what we did is we asked the question, can social media essentially be some kind of a new barometer that can help us quantify what are sort of the mental health challenges that college populations are experiencing? For this, we turn to another social media, which I believe a lot of people would be aware of, and that is Reddit. And we looked at Reddit data that was posted by people associated with over 100 different college campuses in the United States. And we gathered a lot of data. You can see where from which college campuses we gathered our data from in that map on the slide. And you can also see an example of the kinds of things that the college students tend to talk about in these Reddit forums. So one of the reasons we want to assess mental health challenges in college campuses is, of course, because it is a persistent challenge on college campuses. But also the reason we want to make these predictions and measurements is because we want to be in a better position to intervene and help. And when are some of the times, particular points in time when interventions are super critical in terms of their timeliness and appropriateness? That would be the situations when these campuses experience some kind of a collective crisis. So we picked one form of collective crisis that many college campuses in the US tend to experience, and these are mass shooting on gun violence incidents. So over a period of 5 years, we found that there were 12 major gun violence incidents that were reported in these college campuses that were part of our investigation. And what we were able to map are essentially the conversations that were happening on Reddit before and after these gun violence incidents. So here's what we found. We found that actually around these gun violence incidents, as you can see in the top charts, the experiences of stress really changed. Overall, what we found is that in a 30-day period after the gun violence incidents happened, the levels of stress that were gleaned through these Reddit postings in these campuses, this significantly increased compared to a comparable period of time in the past when there was no such events. And that gives us confidence that maybe it is these incidents of gun violence that are causing the increased levels of stress. But it was not just elevated stress. This kind of an investigation where we look to social media data can also tell us what is it that these individuals are experiencing at that point in time. When people experience stress in a college campus after a gun violence incident, what is it that they're talking about? So we did an analysis where we found that the collective attention of this population tends to shift around these events. I guess when there are no such crisis events at a typical point in time, there are still mental health struggles among college students. They can be around classes, around homeworks, around exams, and all of those things which you could consider chronic sources of stress in college life. And that is what you see in the top row of the colored boxes that you see at the bottom of the slide. Classes are something that people are talking about all the time in the left side of the green vertical line. But what we see is that in the immediate aftermath of these gun violence incidents, students are still continuing to be stressed, but they are no longer talking about classes and exams and homeworks. But rather, we see an increase in their collective consciousness, in their connections with other people. And that's why we see words such as people and friends tend to increase in the immediate aftermath of these incidents. So this gives us insights into how collective attention shifts around periods of violence and when people experience stress or other societal upheavals, how do people's narratives of these experiences evolve over time? And by looking to social media data and using AI, we are able to glean those patterns. You might be imagining there have been so many societal upheavals. Can this kind of an approach allow us to get better insights into other societal upheavals as well? Well, that'll be a good question, something that we looked at just in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. What we found looking to Twitter data here is that in the first several months of the pandemic, people's experiences of depression, anxiety, stress, suicidal ideation, all of these had increased in the 2020 time period, which was at a much higher level compared to what people were experiencing or talking about on social media in the year before when there was no pandemic. But what was also interesting is that our data analysis and these AI techniques that were applied on these Twitter postings told us that when people came to Twitter to talk about their psychopathological symptoms, yes, they were talking about these symptoms more, but at the same time, they were also using social media as a means to find support. And as you can see in that plot on the right side of the distribution of the slide, you would notice that both emotional support and informational support were at an elevated level in 2020 in these first few months of the pandemic between March and May 2020 compared to the year before. And that means that in many ways, social media kind of became that platform that normalized conversations of depression, anxiety, and suicide, but also they became that place where people were seeking emotional and informational support. So in so many ways, applying machine learning to analyze social media data can tell us not just about collective attention or people's experiences of mental health struggles, but also how people pursue help and care in ways and in situations where other forms of care may not necessarily be available. These kinds of analysis can be extended to understand population level patterns and experiences of mental health struggles. For instance, by analyzing social media data with AI, we are able to understand how experiences of, let's say, depression varies over the course of a day, how it varies over gender identities, how it varies over geographic locations, how it varies over seasons, and so on. And across the board, what we notice is that the kinds of things that we can measure with social media, they do align what we know about the experiences of depression and other significant mental health challenges, giving us hope that by looking to these kinds of digital trace data, there could be ways for us to better understand and monitor the mental health struggles of people that may not be possible through other means. This field has exploded significantly over the last 10 years, as I've mentioned. So what I gave you examples of are some of the early works that my lab and my collaborators we led over the years. But over the years, as time past, we have seen validation of these techniques, validation of social media as a way to measure and assess and even predict mental health challenges, including suicide. And luckily, it has not been just restricted to academic work. It has been expanded to other situations where monitoring and predicting suicidal thoughts and behaviors can actually bring real help and practical advice to people with struggles. So in the next few minutes, I will take a deeper dive to kind of telling you about what kinds of mental health conversations can be a precursor to suicidal thoughts and behaviors going forward, and how is it that AI can help there. So one of the things that you might know is that when people experience suicidal thoughts and behaviors, they sometimes, go offline. They look for help. they look for information. So we look to Reddit as one of those platforms, as one of those set of communities where many people go to seek help and advice. And that's because Reddit provides a semi-anonymous platform for people to seek those kinds of help. And here is one example of a community within Reddit called Suicide Watch, which is a support forum for people who have thoughts of suicide. What we wanted to understand is that why and when do people post on Suicide Watch, right? Because if it is possible to answer that question, we might be able to intervene sooner and possibly help these individuals from experiencing those types of thoughts. So we went backwards. For every person who ever posted on Suicide Watch forum on Reddit, we wanted to see what other kinds of forums are they posting on. And turns out a lot of them were posting on other mental health forums on Reddit. So we wanted to see, are there certain kinds of patterns of posting in those mental health forums that might be indicative of future suicidal ideation? And we found that indeed AI can help us identify those patterns of mental health discourse. For instance, we found that when people talk about negative mood, they talk about hopelessness, they talk about loneliness, all of those tend to be associated with a greater risk of suicidal discourse going forward. But when in these mental health forums, people talk about feeling loved and valued, people talk about their work, their social context, their families in a positive way, those tended to indicate that these individuals would not go on to talk about suicidal ideation in the future, which gives us hope that maybe we can build what can be called predictive models. By looking at these patterns of language in the past, maybe we can predict when is a certain individual likely to talk about suicide or think about suicide and share that on social media versus not. Because if we can make that forecasting, it can open new doors for intervention. We were successful in making that prediction. And what we found is that by looking at people's language style with some of the things that I talked about just now, those can be incredibly valuable and precious in making those predictions. And we were pretty successful in predicting with almost 80% accuracy individuals who are likely to talk about suicidal thoughts going forward and those who are not. But the potential of social media to understand risk of suicide is not just limited to noticing how they are talking about mental health or other issues on these platforms, but also how other people are responding to them. And again, Reddit is a great platform for that because it's not just a place where somebody can go and talk about their mental health struggles, but it is also a place where other people or peers with similar thoughts, experiences are often there hoping to help these individuals. And you can see some examples here when somebody says what somebody is feeling low self-esteem and says that nobody likes them, other people step up and say they're rooting for them, or they try to empathize with them by sharing their own similar lived experience. But of course, there are different kinds of support that people possibly get on these platforms. And some of those comments are potentially helpful, and some of those are potentially not helpful. There's a lot of bad stuff that also goes on these social media platforms. So we wanted to ask, the fact that a lot of these people are going to social media and other people, peers are trying to provide support or respond to them, can we identify what kinds of support are better? In the sense that are there certain kinds of support that people get on social media that tends to reduce their risk of suicidal ideation? Or conversely, are there certain kinds of commentary that people receive on social media that actually be more harmful? What we found is that indeed there's a great variability. For instance, when people receive emotional support, they receive support that boosts their self-esteem. They receive information that can be instrumental or something that they can act on. All of those are good types of support. These are kinds of support when you get these things online on social media, it tends to reduce the likelihood of suicidal ideation. But on the other hand, when people only get a bunch of information from others or only get short acknowledgments from other people on these platforms, those are not just unhelpful. In some cases, they can actually be pretty harmful. And we find that people who eventually go on to talk about suicidal thoughts in the future are often people who did not get good support from others in their communities. And that would be in the form of poor informational support, short acknowledgments, and so on. So not everything on social media is helpful. And by looking at when people feel loved, supported, and cared for can tell us a lot about when individuals are likely to experience or think about suicidal thoughts in the future. So far I talked to you about the potential of social media data, but obviously in Van der Kolk's notion of the body keeps the score, and if we, go along these lines of the algorithm keeping the score, the algorithms are not just learning from our social media data, but algorithms can also learn from a variety of other kinds of data that can be incredibly valuable for suicidal prevention, right? Suicide prevention. So can we think about what I call an ecology? An ecology because you're putting together different kinds of data together in order to better assess the risk of suicide. What would such an ecology look like? And is it even a good idea to combine different kinds of signals for that purpose? So we set out to answer that question in the context of the rising rates of suicide in the United States, which was the case for many years, over 2 decades, before it started to show some decline. The trend that you see on the slide is something that has been observed across age groups, across gender groups, and it has puzzled many public health individuals, organizations, agencies, and so on. What is it that we can do to address this issue, right? So addressing any kind of crisis like this means that we need to be better prepared, right? Because if we are one step ahead to understand a certain crisis is to know what is it that we should do when that happens, when that comes, which brings us to the question of, can we actually forecast suicide rates so that we can be better prepared with public health interventions, with our campaigns to reduce suicide, and all of those other good things, other tools that we have access to that might actually make a difference? But currently, there have been no ways for us to actually forecast suicide rates. In fact, organizations like the CDC for a very long time relied essentially on historical data to make budgetary allocations in direction of public health interventions for suicide prevention, which can be problematic in a situation when you have the rates of suicide increasing. So in 2025, if you're relying on data from 2022 to make your decisions, they're likely to go wrong because the situation in 2025 is much different from what it was in 22. This means that any ability to actually forecast the future can put us in a much better position to make adequate utilization of our resources for that. So what we wanted to do is to think about this forecasting approach in terms of that data ecology. Are there different kinds of data that we can put together? Are there signals that can be valuable for us in terms of this prediction task? And the idea here was to take suicide-relevant streams of information from social media or the internet, but also combine it with conventional health services data, right? Many people call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline in the US when they experience a crisis. They can show up in an emergency department when they experience a suicide crisis or have those thoughts. So can we combine all of those very rich types of data together and use them and combine them and integrate them intelligently through machine learning and AI in order to forecast rates of suicide? This is how our architecture looked like. We looked at information from the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, emergency department visits, a variety of online platforms such as Google searches, YouTube searches, Twitter data, Reddit, and Tumblr data. And we also included some of the more conventional measures that are known to be indicative of suicide risk at the population level, such as macroeconomic and meteorological data. And we made that prediction by combining these data sources together using AI. And what we found is that when we combine all of these data sources, we can be remarkably accurate compared to the actual level suicide rate in the population in the United States in the year 2018. We found that our prediction model came within an accuracy range, came within an error range of less than 1% in predicting these suicide rates, which gives us hope that sort of this ecological approach where we are combining different kinds of data sources together can be very powerful. And you might be wondering why that is so. It is so because when people experience thoughts of suicide, people experience different pathways to care. Many people look for help, but everybody doesn't pursue the same kinds of help. Some people might be posting on social media looking for peer support. Some people might be searching on a Google's on a search engine. Some people might be going to the emergency department. Some people might be picking up their phone and calling the hotline. All of these are valid and established pathways of care. And the sort of this notion where you combine different kinds of data streams together allows us to kind of look at all of those different pathways to seeking care around suicide, which is when we combine them together, we get a much accurate picture of rates of suicide in the population. So there are many takeaways from this work that we have learned over the years, and that is that these kinds of digital trace data, they hold incredible and immense promise in allowing us to predict adverse events, including risks of suicide. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we were able to put those predictions to good use? This is something that companies have taken up to be a part of their mission over the years. Big tech companies, for instance, Meta, which is the parent company for Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, they have a dedicated initiative within the company for suicide prevention, where they glean through the postings that people make on their different platforms and tools in order to assess levels of risk. And then when risk passes a certain threshold, those are then surfaced to a team of humans who engages appropriate authorities or appropriate sets of individuals. Over the years, there have also been many smaller sort of boutique companies that are trying to harness the potential of digital trace data to predict adverse outcomes such as suicide. This is one example of that. Sentinet is a company that has built a suicide prevention model and used AI in a similar way that I described in our work in the past. And they are looking at these patterns in these online postings and assessing whether some of these might be expressing suicidal ideation or not. And then this idea that technology could be a way for us to assess risk and take action is now being integrated into AI-driven chatbots, because chatbots are a type of AI that increasingly, especially young people, are appropriating during moments of crisis. Here's an example of that. Wobot has a tool that provides AI-based conversational agent. And this is an AI that would engage in a conversation with an individual. And based on the patterns of postings of these individuals, it would assess levels of risk and then surface that conversation, share that with an appropriate clinician where Wobot might be implemented. So I'm going to take a little pause here. And all of this seems like great progress and a great potential for AI and social media and suicide prevention. And still, it all looks a little bit bleak when we read the news these days, right? We hear how a person chatted with a chatbot or an AI, and this was moments before this person took their life. We have seen a number of incidents, especially involving the deaths and suicides of young people, where this individual spoke with an AI in the time before they took that step, and they were talking about experiences and thoughts of suicide in those conversations. In some cases, actually, the AI, instead of judging that this is a moment of risk, the AI actually exacerbated those thoughts. This is alarming. And as much as we are excited about the potential for AI in helping us address and pursue this mission of suicide prevention, AI is a double-edged sword. It can be a great tool, like I described to you today, in assessing all these kinds of risks, because it can allow us to build that algorithm that keeps a score of our mental distress. But at the same time, it can be potentially harmful when the AI does not act in a way that can be in the best interest of the individual. So what is a path forward? And a path forward would be, for I can speak from the perspective of me as a researcher, or those of you who are involved in the research field, is that we have to think deeply about what promise is AI offering in informing mental care and suicide prevention, and how do we take those promises and put them in practice while being aware of the many challenges and working to mitigate those challenges going forward. And these are questions of validity. I mean, is the AI-based prediction valid for every individual? Presumably not. These models make better predictions for certain individuals or subpopulations than others. So how do we make sure we are not creating new streams of inequities in the society? Then there are questions of efficacy, right? I mean, is AI-based prediction, is that good enough? Can it be implemented in public health settings, in service settings, in social work settings? How would it work with whatever the human beings involved in suicide prevention are doing it? How can it augment their ability? Then there are questions of agency, right? There are people who have invested their lives in suicide prevention. How can we make sure that the AIs that we are building allows us to not just maintain that human agency in an experience that is so deeply human, but also hopefully maybe empower us to do better? Humans make mistakes, but humans also do many things really well. So can we think about these AI being a part of our institutions of care, so that the AI empowers us and allows us to augment our abilities to overcome our limitations by helping us forecast risk, by helping us surface problematic patterns, so that we can adopt the right kind of strategy and the right kind of step to support individuals who are in need. And I would end my talk today with a reference to this book by Yuval Harari, 21 Lessons from the 21st Century. This book is a few years old, but one of the things that really struck me in this book was how Harari talked about predictions. And he said that a predictive model, when it's successful is when you don't need the predictive model anymore, or when it's proven wrong. And you might be wondering, if the prediction is wrong, how is that helpful? And Harari says it is helpful because if the prediction model worked as intended, we would be making the right kinds of we would be adopting the right kinds of strategies, or we would be making the right arrangements to prevent the adverse outcome from happening. So the adverse outcome, hopefully in the ideal case, would not happen at all. So can we imagine a future for suicide prevention where we use the AI for our greater good and it empowers us? It puts us in a position where we can take action and extend support where support doesn't exist or support is limited, so that at the end of the day, the AI just disappears in the background. This is all what I have for you today. I would love to take some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Choudhury. That was a really fascinating talk. It's so meaningful. We're really on a precipice of something new here. There was just some research that I just got delivered in my email today that 1 in 10 Canadians are using AI for social supports. So it's something that we really do have to get ahead of and be intentional about rather than be just kind of riding the waves and being reactionary. But it does raise like a lot of interesting questions. For all of those who have questions, I am going to encourage you to add your questions to the QA that's on the bottom bar of the Zoom. And just to kind of start things off, one question that I had that came to mind where you were talking about different inequities and how these AI models can predict suicide better in different populations. And how do we account for those biases in AI in the AI models? Noting that also based on your culture, like you're going to express things differently. Like how's it actually able to pick that kind of thing up?
Yeah, for sure. And this is something we have to be very wary of, because as much fascinating as AI is and picking up patterns from data, but the question that we have to ask is whose data is learning from, right? Is it data of every possible human and every possible experience of suicide and mental health struggles? Unfortunately, that is not what we have today. We have experiences and subpopulations whose experiences are more represented in the AI models, and other populations whose experiences are underrepresented. So this doesn't mean that all AI models are useless. What we need to do is to understand what are the biases and what are the limitations in the predictions or measurements that AI is giving us, but to be able to communicate that information clearly and succinctly. I think that'll be an important step for us to also then recognize in what situations should we trust the AI or use the AI, and in what situations AI should not be used and actually might cause more harm than help. So I think that transparency is something we need to work on as we build these AI, because the AI presumably is not going to help everybody in the same way, but being able to know and identify when it is the case will be important to realize its potential.
Right, absolutely. There's a question from the audience around any data in Canada. I think that ultimately the question is like there's different pathways to care based on where you live. So how are we able to make sure that AI is using that right prediction per location and the system that that person's embedded in?
Yeah, that's a really question. Kind of, thinking about AI and data in that ecological way could be a path forward. Giving the option and recognizing that, different populations might be using less or more certain pathways to care and certain kinds of tools, and how can we gather information from all of those data streams will be important. In terms of the AI, one thing that we have to be wary of is that, if we build, let's say, AI prediction model in the context of the US, it may not be applicable everywhere else in the world. Very likely it will not be, because the way people experience mental health struggles and suicidal thoughts are going to be different. So that means that as we build these AI models, it'll be important to also think about what we call cultural competency. And how do we incorporate cultural competency in these models by including data from that particular societal context in which we hope to apply it in? That would mean that if it's Canada, trying to understand what are those pathways of care that people pursue to get help, and what kinds of data do we need to include to make sure that the AI is reflective of that cultural context. And that means that, parachuting, so to speak, AI models into new contexts can be really dangerous when we are talking about something like suicide. What we need are thoughtful implementations that are focused on building the AI in the context, in the institutions that they're supposed to operate in. And that is hard work, but it is much needed work to prevent harms.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Another question coming from the audience is around thoughts on organizations or governments developing their own machine learning models or proprietary algorithms. Do you think that there's already validated and widely accepted machine learning architectures, or do you anticipate that it's going to be more around kind of private in-house development?
That's a tough question. It is true that some of the biggest AI models are being held behind closed doors by a handful of Silicon Valley companies who are wielding enormous power on the different uses of AI. And AI today is getting integrated in practically every step of our life. So that's something that is recognized as something to think more deeply about in terms of governance of AI, in terms of ownership of data, in terms of who gets to benefit from the AI, and all of those questions. In terms of governmental efforts, I know that there have been a few governments around the world who are kind of trying to build their own AI to counter sort of the investments that are being made in the private sector. For instance, I'm right now in Switzerland, and I know that Switzerland government supported the creation of a very big AI model here, which is one of the first of its kind, completely open AI model. So you can really understand, if you wanted, how this model was created, whose data was used, whose data was not used, how was it trained, what is it good for, what is it not good for. So all of it has all of those good things. And I would love to kind of, I would hope that other governments adopt this kind of an open and transparent approach to AI development, because at this stage, AI is no longer just a private good. I think given its applications and given its immense benefits and harms that it can cause to people around the world, we have to find ways to think about co-creation of AI models that represent voices of different sets of people, and even thinking about a governance approach that takes all those stakeholder perspectives into account.
Yeah, I mean, that brings up so many other questions around, like if there are models that they need to be, or tools that people are using that they need to be to support that mental health, not necessarily the bottom line of a company, and how do you kind of manage that ethical
Right.
piece, I think is a really big question. Just noticing the time, but I'm just going to maybe pop in one more question for you. One question that the audience had was also around being able to predict even early warning signs. Like, and where are the models at in being able to predict that, or do people actually have to be actively, using social media and seeking support for the model to be predictive?
Yeah. This is a fine line, right? Between monitoring for early warning signs, and at what point does it become big brother and become a surveillance approach. And you can imagine that it's very easy to take a tool like that, and if it falls in the hands of bad actors, it can have disastrous consequences. It can create a new dimension of inequity in the society where some people are surveilled to have suicidal thoughts, and they're deprived of the things that they are deserving of, right? We certainly don't want to create that future. So the question is, how do we carefully, thoughtfully, and ethically think about those early warning signals, right? And we found that social media was one way to do that. In many of our work, we look at social media with the consent of the person whose social media data it is, so that questions of surveillance of Big Brother don't show up. But inherently, it does come with a challenge that we then are limited to people who are probably willing to get help already. And the question remains is that how do we reach all of those people who are not reachable through social media or other forms,
Mhm.
or other pathways of care that we know of. And that is going to be a question that we have to continue to ask as a community, but also work towards, with our communities, with the people around us, to destigmatize the conditions so that people feel that they can seek the support that they want.
Yeah, for sure. I think this is really, the beginning of that conversation around like how does AI exist without breaking down community, which is, as you mentioned earlier in your talk, is such a, even in what the research shows, it's such an important suicide prevention strategy is building communities, and that human to human interaction. So I just wanted to thank you so much for this really informative talk. I think this was great for you to kick off our speaker series. We're really excited to have you here. And thank you for coming all the way, even though you're here in Switzerland right now. And I know that there's also questions on the chat also around more of the clinical side of things and how do you integrate that into, clinical care and using this safely. And I think that needs a separate conversation, I think, to really fulsomely to bring that out. So maybe that's something that we can discuss at another session. So please actually on the feedback forms, feel free to say what are things that you're interested in learning about, and we'll do our best to make that happen. We'll be here again on Monday, October 20th from 12 to 1, speaker TBD, but check on our website and we'll let you know who's going to be joining us. Thank you so much, Dr. Choudhury, and hope you have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you, Dr. Rizvi. Thank you, everyone. Take
Yeah,
care.
thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye.